It is certainly after 9 a.m. that I'm calling this meeting to order of the Education, Preparation, and Licensure Study Committee. Committee members in attendance today so far is Mr. Bob Eby, and as you all know, Mr. Nick Darnell is going to join us shortly. Welcome to all who are joining us, and I do want to welcome members of the TACD Executive Board who are joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have them with us. You know, the traditionalists, we do have a lot to cover. We have a lot of great presentations to be shared with us. So what I will do is turn it over to our state board director of research, Ms. Erica Light. She's going to take us through the agenda, and then she will call on each presenter as it becomes their time to speak. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you, Erica.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had to find the button to unmute myself, but are you all able to see the title slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. So thank you to everyone for joining us this morning for this study committee meeting. First, I'm going to briefly go through our agenda for today. We're going to start out today with a couple of presentations from the Tennessee Department of Education staff. The first will be an update on the signed assurances process for educator preparation literacy standards. So these are the new educator preparation standards that are required as part of the Tennessee Literacy Success Act. They will then discuss the admissions appeal process for educator preparation providers. At that point, I will take over as presenter and discuss emergency credentials as a pathway into teaching. We've seen a large increase in emergency credentials the last few years, so we want to take a look at that and see how many of these individuals are getting into the classroom on a long-term basis and getting a full license. We'll then discuss pedagogical assessment data by clinical practice type. So that's looking at students or teacher candidates who complete traditional student teaching pathways versus a job embedded pathway. At that point, Michael will take over and discuss some recent rule and policy update recommendations. And then we will finish out with a discussion with the TACD Executive Board. And at this time, I will pass over the presenting rights to our colleagues from the Department of Education. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everyone, for having us here today. Looking forward to speaking with you all about various activities we have happening at the department and certainly in partnership with various stakeholders, some of which thankfully are on the call today. I will be starting us off, and then Jennifer will be jumping in as well. And this is me not having been on WebEx in a while.
And Brooke, if you wouldn't mind, because one of the things I typically do is ask all of our presenters to state their name and title for the record, and I did not say that today, so my apologies to you for that. But anyway, please proceed.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Brooke Amos. I am our Assistant Commissioner of Human Capital at the Department of Education, and I'll let Jennifer go ahead and introduce herself as well.
Good morning, Madam Chair and board members. I'm Jennifer Nelson, Senior Director of Educator Preparation. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you here. Thank you.
Okay. And am I able to advance the slide, or are you going to do that from your end, Erica?
Let's see. I thought you would be able to, but if
I
can take care of it.
I think I should be able to. Great. Just it has been a little bit since I've been on WebEx. So thank you, everyone. We always like to start by grounding our work in our Best for All strategic plan and our 3 pillars: academic, student readiness, and educators. And much of what we do is at the heart of our 3rd pillar, educators, ensuring that we have great educators and that Tennessee is the best state to become and stay an educator. I am not, this is likely user error, but I am not seeing that I have the ability to advance there. If we could just,
Let's see. Well, now I seem to not be able to advance the slide either. I think, so for me, what happened was if I scrolled down to the bottom of the screen, a little toolbar came up that had an arrow that allowed me to advance the slide. Is that showing up for you at all?
it's not.
Okay, I'll see if I can advance it myself.
Erica, if that fails, you can just stop sharing and then reshare it. And that should fix it.
All right, apologies everyone for the delay, but I think it's hopefully fixed now. Brooke, you can go ahead and continue.
Okay, wonderful. So our first mini presentation will be on our EPP Signed Assurances Update, which is linked to the Literacy Success Act. Can go on to the next there.
Sorry, Elizabeth, it keeps disappearing. Like it'll allow me to advance the slide once and then the arrows to allow me to advance the slide again disappear. So.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you everyone for engaging with this. Okay, great. So our educator preparation programs that offer endorsements in the areas of early childhood, elementary special education, and our instructional leadership programs are aligning with the 2021 EPP Foundational Literacy Skill Standards that are outlined in Policy 5.505. And so they have been asked to complete, excuse me, a signed assurances process. This process has already occurred. And so the 40 EPPs that do have programs in this area have submitted signed assurances at this point that included the 3 sections listed above: an attestation page, matrices that showed course alignment.
Made it in yet?
And clinical experiences, and then showing how they would integrate those foundational skills within their programs. These are all held within our TN Atlas system. We did receive all of the signed assurances and had 100% engagement from the aligned program. So those have been held. We have reviewed those and given feedback, first round feedback for our various programs. So this feedback was an involved process, getting feedback both from our team within our human capital division and then also from individuals in our academics team, where we looked at the matrices, excuse me, and then looked at evidence and then providing actionable next steps for our programs if any of the evidence was not 100% aligned to the rubric. I will say that by and large, programs did a fantastic job at providing information. There was just some minor feedback that was given to a few EPPs, and they are now undergoing a revision process with the department. We gave feedback on foundational literacy skills, again, in concert with our academics team, and on those high quality instructional materials. And so as noted, we are going through that formal revision process currently. We have found that over half of our EPPs are implementing modules created through our EPP Innovation Grant, and have to give a shout out to David and our partners at University of Tennessee, as well as other individuals who have been stakeholders in creating those modules. We're currently in the process of getting feedback on implementation of those modules to see what ongoing support is helpful. And for the EPPs that are required to submit revisions. As noted, the majority are just minor revisions, such as providing more specification across program areas. In terms of next steps, where we are now, we are meeting with various EPPs to talk about any feedback given and provide support for those EPPs. A survey has been going out to determine the needs of faculty in an ongoing basis. We are collaborating with our academics team for a Reading 360 Summit that will be happening in February. We're very excited about this. This will be happening both for districts and for our EPP partners to attend to discuss implementation of these areas and to hear about great partnership combinations between our districts and our university partners, or EPP partners. And then we are going to think about continuing to review and monitor the implementation of these standards through monitoring work, including ideas for observations and other areas. And that information on what that will look like exactly is going to be forthcoming. I think that is my, yeah, if we could go back one, thank you, Erica. I think that is my last update on that, but Jennifer and I are happy to take any questions that you all have regarding this element of the work.
I know I have a question or two, but I want to see if Mr. Eby or Mr. Darnell, who has joined us via the phone, if they have any questions or comments before I pose mine.
Yeah, Madam Chair, this is
Yes.
Bob Eby. I do have one question. So on this Reading 360 Summit, will the state board be invited to attend that too?
Absolutely, if you all would like to join.
I think that would be very informative to us. Or at least I
Wonderful.
hope.
Yes, we can get you all the date for that.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay. Mr. Darnell, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want to make sure if you have any questions, you can ask them at this point.
He's actually having trouble joining. I was just on the phone with him, but he's on his way.
He sent me a text message that he has joined by phone. But anyway, rather than to delay, I'll go ahead and jump in. Back on page 8, which is the EPP signed assurance analysis page, your first bullet point mentions that over half of the EPPs are implementing the modules created through the innovation grant. Does that mean, I want to be clear, and you may have stated it, are the others implementing their own, or are they going to eventually implement those that were developed by the innovation grant? Do we know?
Jennifer, do you mind taking that one?
Sure, no problem. We know that the majority have implemented the EPP innovation modules. We know through revisions that some of them that weren't originally going to implement them have decided to implement them. So we're not sure right at this point how many, but we do know that over half of them have currently, and we expect that number to increase.
I do not remember the deadline, but do you know when they have to have these implemented, the deadline for that?
Yes, that implementation is fall of this year.
Okay, I thought so, but I wasn't sure. And then on page 9, just very simply, you're developing a survey, and I'm pleased to hear that, to determine the specific needs of the faculty at the EPPs. Who's developing that? And are you getting some information that leads you to think you should include certain questions? And I'm asking that just, I know that y'all are very conscientious about this, but ensuring that we capture everything we need to capture from the faculty.
Yes, so we are in partnership with the faculty at UTK in developing that survey. It's gone to academics for review. It's been reviewed on our side, on our team, and it's going through the necessary channels to get distributed.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. No more questions from me. Turn it back over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. I think we will continue then into our next session. And Jennifer, I'll let you take it.
Great. Again, I'm Jennifer Nelson, Senior Director of Educator Preparation at the department. I'm going to spend a few minutes discussing that admission appeals process, what that looks like, sharing some data analysis, and reviewing the admission appeals outcome. So according to state board rule, EPPs can offer admission appeals to allow the EPP to admit applicants who may not have met specific requirements according to policy. And in order to admit the applicant on an appeal, the EPP must submit their appeals process to the department for approval. And to provide a little bit of context, when we speak about admission appeals, those refer to the point at which the applicant is fully admitted into the educator preparation program. Additionally, the requirements that an EPP may allow a teacher candidate to appeal are, we're looking at ACT, SAT, praxis scores at the undergrad level, and GPA at both the undergrad and the post-bac level. EPPs with an instructional leader program, those candidates could appeal 2 years of qualifying education experience, educator effectiveness in the most recent 2 years, or a recommendation by an LEA to participate in an interview. Next slide, please. The educator preparation team conducted an appeals process review of April of this year, and EPPs were asked to identify if they offer an appeals process to applicants seeking admission to either a teacher or an instructional leader program. And for those EPPs who indicated that they did offer an appeals process, we asked them to identify the policy requirement alternatives, admission appeals process and procedures. What does that look like in their EPP? Some potential outcomes, data tracking, analysis use, and EPPs begin implementing their approved admission appeals process fall of this year. And we can move to the next slide, please. So after all the admission appeals processes were approved, the educator preparation team analyzed the data and found that throughout the 44 Tennessee approved EPPs, we have 75 or 33 EPPs, 75% or 33 EPPs offer a teacher licensure formalized appeal process. And about 25% or 11 EPPs do not offer an appeals process for their teacher candidates. And so within the,
Sorry.
that's okay. Within the this teacher preparation space, the majority of EPPs who have an appeals process for their undergrad programs, they do offer an appeal for both the GPA and the test scores, as I mentioned, ACT, SAT, and praxis score. On the post-bac level, 13% offer a GPA, 13 EPPs offer a GPA appeal. And I think we're good to advance to the next slide. So Tennessee has 22 state-approved instructional leader programs, and those EPPs who offer an instructional leader program, we have about 23% or 5 of those 22 EPPs have a formalized appeals process, and 17 EPPs or 77% do not offer an appeals process. And for the EPP who offers an instructional leader appeals, they allow candidates the option to appeal those 3 areas that I mentioned previously. And before we advance, I'd just like to mention, through this deep dive, we discovered there is an inverse proportion of teacher and instructional leader programs offered that offer a formalized appeal process. And we definitely felt that was an interesting find. Next slide, please. Thank you. So through our deep dive into the admission appeals process, I want to make note of several outcomes that we saw. First, we noticed that candidates who do not meet the policy requirements for admission to a teacher or an instructional leader program, we found that those EPPs are considering alternate measures, and some of those in lieu of meeting a requirement, EPPs will ask for candidates' GPA. They will look at passing grades in specific online content courses, passing the praxis core exams, and also they, in lieu of, they look at letters of reference. EPPs ensure candidates have access to the admission appeals procedure, criteria, and process through their website, through handbooks, and course syllabi. We found that EPPs have a clear procedure for the internal review process from the point at which they begin through the notification of the final outcome. We noticed that EPPs have clearly defined potential outcomes of a fully implemented admission appeals. So typically most EPPs have either full admission, probationary admission, and denial. I want to make note that denial occurs when that candidate does not meet the admission appeal criteria set forth by the EPP. We noticed that EPPs definitely have systems and structures in place to track all those candidates admitted on appeal. And some of those things that they track are names, academic qualifications, and other appeal evidence. And last, we found that EPPs have the mechanism in place for providing that pertinent information to the department when requested. And we have noticed that the majority of the EPPs already incorporate this into their quality assurance system. So as you can see, EPPs have some flexibility in their admission appeals. And at this time, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Are there any questions for Dr. Nelson? Did I get your name right? I'm sorry.
I actually do have,
Yes.
oh, sorry.
Yes.
Okay, I've got a couple questions.
Okay.
Yeah, this is about.
Mr. Eby, Mr. Eby,
This
go ahead.
actually ties back to the first section of just, you said here that there's 44 Tennessee approved EPPs, but in the section that Ms. Amos said, she said there were 40 EPPs that have all assigned assurances. So does that mean that there's 4 that haven't assigned, or is there, I'm kind of confused there.
Thank you. Great question. There are 40 EPPs that have a program that affects the literacy standards. So we have some LEA EPPs that have like CTE, occupational license, that would not affect those licensures. So that's where that discrepancy is.
Perfect, thank you. And then on your presentation, you said, I think like 25% don't have an appeals process. Why is that the case? Is it they don't want to have the option to appeal? Either you pass or you don't pass, or if that's the case, the 11 that don't, how is the performance of their teachers, their graduates, compare with performance of the ones that have appeal process? Do we know that?
Thank you for that question. Yes, so I will make an assumption that some of the reason that they would not offer an appeals process is because the accountability piece on the EPP, maybe they weren't performing as well as needed on annual reports, or some internal reasons why they just choose not to have it. But I do know that we're working currently with some EPPs that have elected not to have an appeal so that they can receive better annual reports or remove themselves in that section.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Derline.
So one thing I'd say on that last question too, we did, when I was over at the department working on annual reports, we had a metric related to ACT that was fairly recently dropped, and it kind of limited the percentage of folks who could be admitted on appeal to 5%. So with that being dropped now, I think there's kind of a more of a willingness to consider alternative measures. One question I have, I know it's kind of early in the process, but are you at all finding kind of best practices or things that are sticking out that could be shared with the EPP community? Because I do think that with kind of a lack of communication thus far around what makes for a good appeals procedure, I think it's probably a good idea to share that information back out. So I just wonder, are any EPPs sticking out as far as having a strong system to admit candidates on appeal?
Thank you for that question, Michael. And one EPP that really stuck out to me that I noticed is they kind of have a sliding scale. So they will open their appeals process until they reach a certain threshold. And that threshold is an average 3.0 GPA of the cohort. And that kind of leans back to the Educator standards. But I thought that was really interesting. So they have that appeals process for anybody coming in until they reach that 3.0, and then they stop that appeals process. So I thought that was very different. Haven't seen that before. And I think for that EPP, that's you know, a really good example. That may not necessarily work for all EPPs, and also depending on the size of the EPP, there's a variety of different factors. But that was just one example that stuck out.
Are there other questions or comments? Okay, thank you both very much. Dr. Nelson and Ms. Amos, we appreciate you being here and sharing this information with us today. And I'm sure we'll be meeting with you again in the future at some of these sessions. So thank you so much. Okay, turning it back over to you, Erica.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. My first presentation this morning is about emergency credentials as a pathway into teaching. To state my name for the record, I am Erica Light. I am the Director of Research for the State Board of Education. So here in Tennessee, we have two main types of emergency credentials. The one that we're going to be focusing on today is the permit. This is granted to individuals who do not hold an active Tennessee educator license. In order to be issued a permit, an individual must have a minimum of a bachelor's degree, and they must be recommended by the director of schools or charter school leader where they are intending to teach. Permits are subject to approval by the Commissioner of Education, and they are valid for only one academic year and expire on June 30th following the date of issuance. An individual can be issued no more than 3 permits. So unlike a license where you can renew your license over and over again, if you get to your 3rd permit and you still have not moved on to a license, then at that point you would not be able to have your permit reissued again. The other type of emergency credential we have in Tennessee is an endorsement exemption. These are also commonly known as waivers. These are for licensed educators who are seeking to teach courses outside of their area of endorsement. These also must be requested by the director of schools or charter school leader and are also subject to approval by the commissioner. They're valid for 1 school year and may be renewed up to twice. So they're similar to permits in that way, but these are again for people who do have a license already. So for the remainder of this presentation, I will be focusing on educators who have a permit. In the state board's recently approved master plan for 2022 through 25, we have a goal stated that by 2025, 65% of educators teaching on a permit will obtain a full and valid license within 3 years of when they initially received their permit. The reasoning behind this goal is that we've seen an increase in educators teaching on these emergency credentials. These are people who clearly have interest in education and being in the classroom. And we want to make sure that we are tapping into that resource of individuals who have the passion for teaching and want to be in the classroom and help them to get into the classroom on a long-term basis rather than just an emergency basis. In the process of setting this goal, the state board staff examined how many of our permitted educators subsequently obtained a license. And that's the data that I will be presenting shortly. First of all, as I mentioned, we've seen a large increase in the number of permits issued per year, especially in 2021-22. Part of the reason for this is that state law normally prohibits permits for elementary physical education and courses that have an end of course exam. However, this prohibition was temporarily removed for the 2021-22 school year, and that is part of the reason why we saw this big uptick in permits. However, that's not the only reason. The most common area in which an educator receives a permit is elementary education. So we know that a lot of these permits that were issued in 21-22 were not in areas where they were previously prohibited. As part of this analysis, I looked at whether educators who were teaching on a permit had held a license in Tennessee before. And this is important because people who've held a license before are potentially eligible to reactivate that license. Not in all cases, but in many cases they could potentially reactivate their license. So out of the 2,900 educators who received their initial permit in the 3-year period that I'm looking at here, which is 1819 through 2021, many previously had, or about a quarter previously had a license. So not a majority, but like a sizable number of them previously held a Tennessee teaching license. And out of those who had previously held a teaching license, many of them, that license had been expired for less than 1 year. So these are people who very recently held a license and could potentially be eligible to reactivate or advance that license. They may be missing something like an assessment score that is preventing them from advancing or reactivating their license. Then we had some who had had their permit or their license had been expired for 1 to 5 years, and some who'd had their license expired more than 5 years. So those folks might have a harder time reactivating the license at that point, but many had only very recently held a license.
So, Erica, before you,
Yes.
the primary, I say it's a large number of less than 1 year. And if they had an active license, and the thing expired, do we know why? I mean, did they just forget to reapply, or what was the reason you gave why it probably expired?
So I don't have systematic data on this, but in many cases, it's probably that they were missing something that was required in order to advance or renew their license. And that could have been they were missing an assessment score, they didn't have enough years of qualifying experience, they didn't have enough professional development points. Things like that could theoretically prevent you from being able to renew or advance your license. And that's actually an issue that Michael will be talking about a bit later when we discuss licensure recommendations. But there are a variety of reasons other than just forgetting to renew your license that would cause people to be in this situation.
Kim Hawkins just put a chat on that she had worked with a lot of people who had taken off to have a child or something, and they're expired by it. So that's helpful too. Thanks. Okay.
And just to follow up on that, Erica, I believe you said that we do not systematically have that data. So it's just never collected. So we would never be able to pull out and look at those reasons. Is that my understanding? Is that correct?
So I could look in TN Compass, for example, to see if someone was missing an assessment score or if they were missing qualifying experience, but I don't have a good way to do that for a batch of people at the same time. I would have to look people up individually.
And that would be pretty laborious, I'm sure. Okay. It may not make sense to do that. Clearly, that's a lot of time. I wonder if, not even anecdotally, but if there would be a view of some of them, just a random sampling to get some idea. And I don't know how relevant it is to have it, but I think based on this discussion, there may be a basis to do that. But we can talk about it offline. Okay.
The reason I asked the question is if there was a systematic reason why it expired, for many of the cases, the same reason. Is there something that we need to do better in educating people to not let it expire? That was the only reason I'd ask the question.
Good reason to ask. Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in. I just have a little context here that might be useful. So the department has set up automatic notifications that are sent to educators beginning in, I believe, October of the year prior to the license expiring. And as it gets closer to the date of expiration, the frequency of those emails actually increases. So my guess here is that it's not for lack of knowing that their license was expiring, but that kind of what Erica said, they just simply didn't meet the requirements. But again, I think some of the recommendations that we're bringing before the board around licensure may help resolve some of these issues.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Moving on to the next slide, I looked over this 4-year period next to see how many of these people who had their license issued during this period, or had a permit issued during this period rather, eventually became licensed. And for this specific analysis, I was looking only at teacher licenses. So we excluded administrator licenses and school services personnel licenses from this particular table here. So we saw that people who started teaching on a permit in 1819, these are the, out of this whole group, they've had the most time to move on to a full license, and about 42% of them have. So that's a decent percentage, but as I mentioned earlier, we set in our master plan goal that we wanted to see 65%. We understand that it's not feasible or necessarily desirable for every single one of these people to become a long-term educator, because not everyone finds that they're a good fit for the profession, but we do want to see more of them becoming long-term, fully licensed educators. In the more recent years, there's been fewer or smaller percentage that have become licensed, but especially for the 2 most recent years, that could just be because the person is still working on getting the license. Their permit is still valid. They're able to be teaching on a permit for another year or so, and so they are potentially going to get a license, but just haven't gotten one yet. Apologies, I lost my access to the advanced buttons again, so I'm going to briefly unshare my screen and then reshare it.
While you're doing that, that one column was the initial license year. And you got the data of those that became licensed. What about those that have had renewed permits? Is there a higher percentage of them who eventually get their license, or do you know that?
I've not specifically looked at that. The pathways that you can take to get a license, some of them allow you to have the license issued almost right away if you have, especially if you have a content area assessment. So I actually have on the next slide information about how educators can advance from a permit to a license. And one of those pathways is you enroll in a job embedded program at a state approved EPP. And if you enroll in a job embedded program, you need to show that you've got the content expertise for your endorsement area. But once you've shown that and you've enrolled in the program can recommend you for licensure right away. So even someone who's in their first year teaching on a permit, they could enroll in a job embedded program during that first year and have their license issued right away and not have to renew their permit. Some people, if they don't have that content assessment score, though, they may need more time. Or if they're doing a different pathway to licensure, like such as one of the other ones listed here. So the job embedded pathway is one way. You can also, if you've previously held a license, you can follow the steps to reactivate that license. Those are outlined in state board rule. And then there's also this new pathway, which this pathway at this point is so new that no one has actually gone through it yet, but we'll be watching in the next few years to see how this plays out. But there was a law passed earlier this year that created a new type of teaching license called a limited license. And this basically allows teachers who are on their second or third permit to keep teaching for 2 more years while they're working on getting their license. And instead of having to enroll in a full educator preparation program, what these people would need to do at that point to move their limited license over to a full practitioner license is they still need to complete some coursework. It's less than a full EPP worth of coursework, but they would need to complete coursework at a Tennessee approved provider. They would need to receive support from a highly effective clinical mentor and also submit qualifying scores on all required content assessments for their endorsement area. So this is a new pathway that we'll be watching the next few years and see if this leads to a higher percentage of permitted educators ultimately achieving a full license. This was my last slide on this topic, so I'm happy to take any questions at this time. Any other questions?
Erica,
Yes.
in the perfect world, obviously we would want everyone to be able to go through an EPP. We would want them, you know, not to have to get a waiver or, you know, anything, you know, a different way. But we know that's not realistic right now where we're at. Do you have any information on what the numbers of EPP enrollments for this year look like? Are we still declining as we have been for years, or has that leveled off? Do you have anything on that?
So for the current academic year, I do not have numbers on that yet. For the most recent cohort of educators who are going to be added to the educator preparation report card this year, so that's from 2021. We always run a bit behind on those because we have to watch to see after they graduated, did they get a teaching job? But in that most recent cohort we looked at, there was a small decline from 2020, but it was only a few people, so it was not like a precipitous decline. But it is also true that we've not seen that number going back up yet.
Maybe
Perhaps
that's a
it could be
question
more
for
of-
for
Yeah.
David.
I was just going to jump in and say that. And if we want to do that now, or if we want to wait to our discussion time with them, either way. And I think Kim Hawkins just put a comment out. Let's see if I can get to it. Do you see it, Erica? I'm trying to.
Yeah.
I believe she was saying that they've now have at her institution more job embedded candidates and fewer traditional candidates.
Okay. And why don't we go ahead and talk about that in our discussion points with them later on, if that's okay. We'll continue
right.
with continue with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my next presentation is on pedagogical assessments. So these are assessments that test teaching skills rather than content knowledge. And they are currently required for all teacher candidates who are going through a Tennessee EPP. Exactly when you have to do them, though, is different depending on what type of program you're in. And so the first thing I'm going to discuss here is the different types of clinical practice that are offered in Tennessee EPPs, because this affects when you have to do your pedagogical assessment, and is also related, as we will see in the following slides, to your likelihood of passing your pedagogical assessment on your first attempt. So we have the most traditional pathway is student teaching, in which a candidate has a planned semester of at least 15 weeks where they are conducting full-day teaching and observation activities. We also have several EPPs that offer a full-year clinical practice, which is known as an internship or a residency. This is a longer, more intensive version of student teaching, but it is not, the person who is completing this internship is not serving as the teacher of record. The job-embedded candidates, on the other hand, they receive their license at the beginning of their program, and they serve as a teacher of record while they are enrolled in and still completing their program. So for the remainder of my slides, these first two groups, the student teaching and internship, are going to be grouped together, not because they're exactly the same, but because both of those groups are completing their EPP before they serve as teacher of record, whereas the people who are in a job embedded program are already teacher of record while they're in their EPP. We have two different pedagogical assessments that are used in Tennessee. The first one is called the Practice Principles of Teaching and Learning, or it actually is supposed to be Practice Principles of Learning and Teaching because it's abbreviated PLT. This is the more traditional, you go to a test center, you take a 2-hour computer-based assessment. It's got both multiple choice and constructed response questions. This assessment is offered in 4 grade bands, but it's not content specific. And this was accepted for licensure in all endorsement areas in Tennessee until December 31st, 2018. Now it is still used for licensure of occupational teachers, but it is no longer accepted for licensure of academic teachers. On January 1st, 2019, Tennessee switched to using the EdTPA, which is a performance-based portfolio assessment where candidates during their clinical practice assemble a portfolio that includes things like student work, lesson plans, assessments, and videos of themselves delivering instruction. So this is a much more labor intensive, takes a long time to put together portfolio assessment compared to the traditional computer-based 2-hour assessment. The EdTPA is offered in 28 different content areas, so it is content specific, although the majority of the test is the same across content areas. I think I remembered about a quarter of it is content specific and the rest is the same across content areas. This became a statewide requirement in 2019, although many EPPs were already using it before then, and it was accepted before then. It was just before January 1st, 2019, you could do either one. So to make things more complicated, we of course had the COVID pandemic, and at its special called meeting in September of 2020, this board voted to give EPPs and teacher candidates flexibility on pedagogical assessments during the 2020-21 academic year. As I mentioned, the EdTPA involves actually like doing activities in a classroom, filming yourself delivering instruction, and some school districts during this academic year of 2020-21 were not having normal in-person classes for the entire year. So during that academic year only, certain teachers were allowed to submit scores on the PLT instead of the EdTPA. However, it was not up to the individual candidate to decide this. It had to be their EdPrep provider had to submit a form on their behalf requesting that they be allowed to take the PLT instead of the EdTPA. So before I get into the data slides, I just want to note that the following slides show data on 4 cohorts of teachers. We had 2017-18 is the oldest that's included in here, and then 2020-21 is the most recent. This includes only teachers who attended a Tennessee approved EPP. So we have a couple EPPs, for example, Relay Graduate School is now a state approved EPP, but at the time that this data was collected, it was not. So those candidates would not be included in this analysis. We also do not include occupational teachers because they've never had to do the EdTPA. That's not a requirement for them. And this data set includes only exams that were taken on or before August 31st, 2021. So first we have the student teaching and internship candidates. So these candidates must complete their pedagogical assessment and submit a passing score before they can have their license issued. We can see that over the years, so back in 2017-18, either the EdTPA or the PLT was accepted. A significant number of candidates took both. We're not entirely sure why they took both exams. They only needed to do one, but that's why the percentages add up to more than 100%. Over time, we see more candidates doing the EdTPA and fewer doing the PLT, with the exception of in 2021, we saw once again an uptick in the PLT, and that was because of that COVID flexibility that was offered during that year. For job embedded candidates, the timing of the assessment is different. So they receive their license at the beginning of their program, and that license is valid for 3 years. They need to submit their EdTPA or PLT score before they can renew the license. So they have 3 years to teach before they have to actually submit that. That's why we see in this group, there's a significant portion who took neither of these exams. In the case of the more recent groups, like the 2019-20 and the 2020-21, the real interpretation here is they've not taken the exam yet. Not that they're never going to take it, they just haven't gotten to that point yet. For the older cohorts of 17, 18, and 18, 19, those people, the vast majority of them would have needed to take that exam by now if they were going to renew their license. So the people who are in that took neither category most likely did not renew their license. And that may be because they moved to another state, they decided to pursue a different career. There could be any number of reasons for that. But we also see over time that a significant number of these candidates were taking PLT more than were taking EdTPA. And once again, that was during those years when you were able to take either. So final slide here, we have the first time pass rates on the PLT and the EdTPA for both student teaching internship candidates and job embedded candidates. As you can see, the job embedded candidate pass rate is lower on both exams, but the difference is significantly larger on EdTPA. An important caveat here is as you saw on the previous slide, we observe EdTPA scores for relatively few job embedded candidates at this point. Before we get to the February meeting of the board for the state board's quarterly meeting, I'm going to request updated EdTPA data from Pearson so that we can hopefully see a few more job embedded candidate scores and get a bigger sample size here. But based on what we did have, we saw that the job embedded candidate first time pass rate on EdTPA was a little over 82%, which was 12 percentage points lower than the pass rate for student teaching or internship candidates. And now we're not fully transitioning to our discussion with TACTI at this point. We will come back for one more presentation, but I would like to ask any TACTI members who would like to chime in about how at your institution, how does the process of completing the EdTPA differ for the job embedded candidates? And why do you think that we see these lower pass rates for the job embedded candidates? David, there's something wrong with your audio and we can't understand you.
I want to say you sounded like Mickey Mouse. And you definitely are not Mickey Mouse.
Okay, it looks like David left and is going to come back into the meeting, and
Okay.
hopefully that will resolve his
Okay.
audio issue.
And Erica, if we want to, unless somebody else wants to jump in right now, we could come back to your slide and at the end when we are in discussion with the TACTI executive board. Okay, we can
Yes,
try that.
that will work. We can just keep these questions in mind and we will come back to them when we get to our discussion with the TACTI executive board.
And it looks like he might be back on, but we can go ahead and move forward. Anybody else have any questions on the data that has been shared with Ms. Light, Ms. Erica Light? Anything at this point? Thank you very much. It's so important to have this information, and your position certainly provides us with the ability to review this information and have informed decisions as we move forward. So thank you for that. I think, are you ready to turn it over to Michael?
Before you do, I do have one question.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do we have enough data on the job embedded candidates who, the 94 versus 82, the job embedded, to know how effective or if there's that much demarcation too in the effectiveness of the teachers, of the ones who've been through the program and who come through the job embedded program?
So that's something we've not really been able to look at the last few years, primarily because of cancellation of testing, and then also in 2020-21, teachers were allowed to nullify parts of their evaluation. So that makes the evaluation data difficult to compare. We did find from an analysis before COVID that we had within Tennessee, but this was not broken out by job embedded versus other types of programs. But just in Tennessee in general, we had candidates who had a strong EdTPA score were showing higher first-year observation scores in the classroom. But that was not broken out by job embedded, so I can't say if the people with job embedded programs were actually performing significantly differently in their first year.
That might be good to have in the future, just to know.
Yes, makes sense. Thank you.
Good suggestion. Is it time to move on to Michael Durline?
Sure.
All right. I might have to advance the slides still, but I think Michael only has one slide, so hopefully this will go smoothly.
Thanks, Erica. Michael Durline, Deputy Executive Director, Policy and Research at the State Board. So I wanted to provide just some reminders and context for some of the recommendations that went before the board around licensure issuance, renewal, reactivation, and also candidate assessment. The licensure rule recommendations include the ability for someone to maintain a practitioner license, that's academic, occupational, or school services personnel license, in perpetuity. We found at the department oftentimes if someone let their license expire because their initial license expire because they did not meet advancement criteria. So Kim's suggestion there that some folks take time off to be with children. Sometimes they had to let their license expire, and we had to tell them that in order to get their license back, they had to go back and take tests. This would allow them to continue to renew the license without having to take assessments. They would just simply not be able to advance until they had the experience. The second recommendation is renewal of a professional license based on 2 years of qualifying experience. So this recommendation was based on the idea that some people go teach in settings that would qualify for licensure advancement and should also qualify for renewal of the professional license. So they may not have the professional development points, but they're actively teaching somewhere else. The next recommendation is around reactivation of a professional license. This is one we were just talking about a moment ago. Under current policy, educators who hold a professional license that goes inactive must retake assessments. This would provide 2 new pathways by which they could reactivate a license using professional development points or demonstrating that they're teaching in a qualifying setting. And then lastly, we also saw that there were some challenges for folks who hold an academic license and qualified to get an occupational license or vice versa. So we're recommending to make that process a bit easier. On the assessment side, we are recommending removal of the EdTPA simply for job embedded candidates on the basis of the evaluation that they're getting from their administrators, the fact that they are serving as teacher of record and doing the job every day. And lastly, recommending that if someone holds a major in the content area and obtains a job embedded in a job embedded program and obtains a license through that pathway, they would not be required to pass the content assessment to renew or advance the license. So it's kind of a comprehensive look at licensure, and we wanted to really hit some of those things that we felt were increasing flexibility but not decreasing rigor, and that we still had some solid backstops for folks to demonstrate pedagogical skill and content knowledge. I'd be happy to take any questions or clarification on the recommendations at this point.
And Mr. Durline, I do want to mention that we always in our meetings on items for first reading, you're always stressing that we have time in between first and second reading to receive feedback. And I certainly would recommend that anybody listening, and in particular our TACD executive board members, I would really urge you to include any of your feedback that you want to share. I know we'll have a discussion in just a few minutes, but I think it's important to say that we heard these on first reading. And so even with the licensure rule, there will be a rule making hearing, and then there's other steps in the process that we have to take. So just wanted to mention that. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah,
Michael, I want to focus on the renewal of a professional license based on 2 years qualifying experience. Can you talk to that just a little bit more? So I know, one example could be someone who has recently retired. Maybe they didn't get enough, professional development points. Maybe they were close, but then, they didn't do any development for, several years and that lapsed. Or could that be somebody, let's say, that taught 10 years ago, who doesn't have PD and then wants to come back? Can you kind of clarify who are we trying to target with this?
Yeah, I actually think the scenarios you just gave fall into two different categories. So the first one you gave would be somebody who, if they were not actively teaching during the validity period of their license, they would still be able to renew the practitioner license with simply demonstrating that they are doing professional development. Right now, if that individual would not be able to go past the second issuance of the practitioner license, so they would only have 6 years to get the experience, unless they met the advancement requirement. So that's the first group. So if somebody's actively doing professional development, and oftentimes districts allow folks to participate in their experiences at the district level, but they also have a number of options available to them online. It's a small group of people, but we definitely heard from them when I was at the department. So it's not uncommon. And these people are kind of stuck in limbo. And then the second scenario you described, if someone held a license 10 years ago, they would actually fall under the reactivation. They would likely fall under the reactivation requirements and would have new pathways available to them that did not require tests.
Okay. So what would be the requirements there, Michael? Because I'm just trying to think, if someone has been out of the field for an extended period of time, not just a few years, but let's say a very long period of time, this is my 17th year, and a lot has changed since I began. So, looking at the requirements and the different changes over that time period, I just want to make sure that we have things in place, where if someone's coming back from an extended period of time, that they're going to receive the training and education that they need to be successful.
Yeah, it's a good question. So under the current policy, the options available to those folks where they'd have to go back and take an assessment or demonstrate that they held a license in another state or demonstrate that they were nationally board certified. Under the two new pathways, one would require that they go back and earn professional development points, and that would fall under the board's policy for professional development activities. And those have to be instructionally focused, directly related to instruction. There are some other options there as well, but they're pretty tightly controlled. So that's probably the most relevant pathway for the individual you just described. The second one would allow for other experience to count. So those would be people who are actually actively teaching somewhere.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clarifying that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had a couple questions. So following up on next question there, so the 2 years of qualifying experience, that is teaching someplace else, or what do you consider qualifying experience?
Yeah, so there's actually a document on the department's website that the department defines qualifying experience for advancement. I think in this case, for reactivation of a license, it would be the same types of experience. So when someone is seeking to reactivate an expired professional license, if they were under this proposed change, if they were to present evidence that they were teaching in a private setting that maybe didn't require the license, a qualifying private setting, or out of state, and it certainly didn't require a Tennessee license, then in those cases, they could present that experience and be able to reactivate their license.
Will our rule better define that than just saying qualifying experience, or is that left to a lot of judgment by the department or or whomever?
That right now we did not plan to put the types of qualifying experience in a rule or policy. I think we could discuss that. It's been the same set of experiences for quite a while, I would say. And it's pretty, I'm happy to share that with everyone.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about this is sort of what it is or the expectation, but when it's that broad, I'm just wondering if we need to be a little more defined or something like that. So yeah, I'd like to have that conversation. And then the second comment I had, going back on the removal of the EdTPA requirement for job embedded candidates, because of that is again why I went back to ask the question before on the 82.3 versus 94. You know, going back to our quality comments that we want, we want high quality teachers. How do we assure that by removing that requirement that we're not impacting the quality of the teachers, particularly if 12% of them less than that are passing that exam? So something to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would be interested to hear from the TACT folks as far as what they think around why that pass rate might be lower. I have my suspicions, but I don't want to put it out there because I'm certainly not in a position like they are. I would also say that EPPs have a lot of control over how candidates are assessed throughout the program. And they make the determination as to whether somebody should be recommended for licensure or whether they should be declared as a completer in their program. And that is all done in the TN Compass system. So somebody's licensure transaction really hinges on that EPP recommendation, both on getting a license and maintaining a license.
Thank you.
I do see there are a couple questions in the chat. I'm happy to address those if that makes sense. Charlotte Ellington asked, when, if this is passed for job embedded, would it be for those who are presently enrolled in a program or only for those from the date of passage? Great question. I'm getting that question quite a bit over email. That is something we're actively discussing, and there are a whole lot of options there. So if you do have feedback, please send it to me. If you have thoughts as far as who you think that should apply to. I think we recognize that any policy shift is going to benefit some and not others. There are going to be folks who, if this does go into effect, who just completed the EdTPA and may be frustrated that they had to do it. But there's really not an easy way around that. But if you do have recommendations as far as timeline goes, please send them to me. Kim Hawkins asked, what if their expired license is not professional, but one of the older types, apprentice, interim type B, or probationary? So for those individuals, Kim, these two new options would not apply to them. And the reason being, those, like the interim B was a license that was issued many, many years ago that I believe was issued to someone who couldn't pass content assessments. Well, in order to reactivate that license, they'll have to pass content assessments, because the assumption is that if somebody made it to a professional license, they've completed a program and they've passed assessments at some point in time if they were required. So anybody who was on those initial level licenses that are no longer issued would still have to go through the current reactivation pathways. Another question, could EdTPA be waived for job embedded teachers with LOE scores of 3+? If a teacher is a level 1 or 2 job embedded teacher, then they would be required to complete EdTPA. Great question. We definitely discussed this. I think a significant concern was that LOE scores typically aren't available until the fall. And so you could, if you set up a scenario where individuals who obtain an LOE of 3+ for 2 years are exempt from the EdTPA, but they don't find out that they had 2 years, that second year of a 3+ until November or later, that gives them very little time to complete the EdTPA. And at that point in time, they're also likely disconnected from their EPP because those job embedded programs do not take 3 years to complete. So there are some concerns around that. But if you have other thoughts, Julie, around what that might look like, please also send them my way.
Michael, I think some folks were asking for your email address, so maybe you could share that in the chat.
Happy to do so.
All right, well, the only thing we have remaining is the discussion. So Madam Chair, if you think that we should move into that at this time, I'm happy to do that.
I think we should, unless there are any other questions or comments before we move away from this discussion. Okay, well, let's go ahead. Thank you, Ms. Light and Mr. Durline, for your presentations today. Always informative, and thank you so much. I don't know if you want to go back to the questions in the slide. I believe it was page 31, which I don't think the slides are numbered, but I numbered mine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm going to have this up for a little bit so to refresh your memory, but then I will probably unshare my slides so that we can see more people's faces on the video.
That's a great idea. Thank you very much. So we are ready to move into our discussion with the TACTI Executive Board. Thank you again so much for being here with us. Why don't we start with this slide and provide us with your input with regard to these two questions. And I will not read them, but if you want Erica to read them for the record, we can certainly do that, but I don't know that that's necessary. Erica, what do you think?
Well, the presentation slides are also part of the record, so they will be.
Okay, that's good. And I know that David Shihak was trying to speak, and let's see, are you able to talk now? And did you clear up your audio issues? Do we want to find out?
I'm going to check.
Ah,
Thank you, Mike.
Yes, we can hear you now. That's good.
You sound very good. Great.
I know Mr. Durline knows that. Like every 7th Zoom I'm on, I sound like Mickey Mouse. Sometimes I get Donald Duck too. So, but I just want to thank you all on behalf of TACTI and allowing us to be a part and hearing our voice. And I think some of the comments I might have mentioned may not come to a surprise to Mr. Durline and just having a long relationship with TACTI, even as his previous role, always reaching out to TACTI and the stakeholders. And we do plan to send a more formal response before I think the next February meeting. Before I get into these questions, I just wanted to, the process for completing that DPA different. I can only speak to UTK on this one. I did not ask TACTI fully. I did get some opinions and some thoughts from TACTI membership regarding the TPA and praxis consideration for job embedded. So I can probably speak to that a little bit more fully. But I know at our university, we were doing TPA long before the state required it for licensure. And so our process for completing TPA is really no different than any of our quote alternative or traditional kind of pathways, whether that be our internship program or our student teaching programs, our undergraduate programs, or our post-baccalaureate programs. And actually, TACTI has had real concerns around TPA for a host of reasons that we could probably get into at another time, but I'll definitely bring up some of the reasons why we think that there's a lower pass rate. And for one reason, it's a much more robust exam. It's a performance-based assessment that requires a lot of videotaping and a lot of explanations, and more than that the PLT would kind of assess. You know, we always did the analogy of the difference between somebody getting a driver's exam. I can pass the written part, but can you drive the car? And the TPA is more of that performance-based assessment. And so there needs to be a lot of demonstration on that. But we do have concerns about EdTPA overall. I did want to bring up one point of clarification on the one slide that said types of clinical practice. Just before I go a little bit further, I noticed the term intern and resident was used. Is that interchangeable? Did I miss a policy, or have we operationally defined what a residency is?
I think the issue here is that there's not a clear definition of what an internship or a residency is, and some ed preps use the term internship and some use the term residency, both to refer to a full year program of clinical practice. So that's one thing that we're looking at and I think Michael could also speak to this, but we need to have a more clear definition of what those are.
Yeah, I'll just add, when the department reviews proposals for new programs, residency programs like, say, the Nashville Teacher Residency or the Memphis Teacher Residency are lumped into the internship categories simply because they're typically a year-long clinical practice experience. So there's not a great rationale for it. The definition of residency, there are national definitions. It's a lot more complex, and I do think there could be some room to investigate that and better define residency clinical practice in the future.
Thank you. I mean, I know that's one of our recommendations. But a lot of times when we use the shorthands or even the latest, the grow your own, and considering those kinds of initiatives that are going at it in terms of really recruiting candidates and aspiring teachers with a defined clinical pathway. But overall, regarding EdTPA, let me bring up my notes here. At this time, really TACTI's in agreement on a couple of points. One, flexibility with praxis and EdTPA are ultimately a good thing. These assessment proposals, although should not just be limited to job embedded. The two concerns that we have are why just job embedded, and why no discussion of an alternative accountability measure. We are concerned that, well, first I'll say, in terms of the rationale that we were hearing about, that mirrors other clinical pathways, such as a post-bac internship or internship kind of pathway, in which it's a year-long, high-quality mentor being evaluated on a state-approved assessment. And that sounds very much like what the rationale for getting eliminated for job embedded as well. So we could clearly have two people in a post-bac program, essentially focusing on a lot of the pedagogical. One would still be required to do EdTPA and one would not. So we were thinking about, is the appetite for other pathways to be considered as well, and trying to be more equitable for our candidates, regardless of the pathway that is chose. Accountability measures, if EdTPA is limited, I think Julie Baker brought this up, consideration of LOE scores, or something to that effect. I mean, I understand some of the timing issues related with that, but we want to make sure that we are not lowering our accountability, and making sure that, we're having those teachers that have that high impact and that high quality that we would expect. I'm moving. Praxis is similar. Right now, if it's being discussed as kind of removing praxis for job embedded only, we have other pathways in which they have the major. So again, why just limiting to job embedded? For other programs that also have that major, why would they be required to take that if they were in a other clinical pathway as well? This is just kind of a comment overall regarding dropping the requirement. As I've kind of told my faculty and some of the things we've talked about, EdTPA is really intertwined through our state approved program. That would require us to submit all new special area programs for approval. I would anticipate if this was passed that me and many of our colleagues and our ed prep programs would be submitting new SAP proposals for consideration and review. And I would urge that if this did happen, that learning that, informing the EPPs regarding that process of the state approval process, because most of our standards alignments include that major artifact of EdTPA, which would all need to be kind of decoupled out of that. We are concerned about unintended consequences. And candidates moving to job embedded under the perception that it's an easier pathway. And especially some of our traditional students, like, why do I finish this program when I can go job embedded? And with job embedded only being a singular endorsement, many of our ed prep programs have been very responsive to our district needs, as well as the Department of Education calls for more dual enrollment, or I should say at least previous officials at the Department of Ed will call for dual endorsement pathways, the have LEAs with that licensure flexibility, or what at the time was the mindset for that teacher and the whole child. With job embedded only being a singular pathway, it limits that opportunity for candidates to get a dual endorsement at the same time. What they were required to do would be to come back and get an additional endorsement, which could add additional cost, rather than it all being embedded upon initial licensure. I would say lastly, implications with Title II. Federal Title II is how we kind of note our completers, and matching Tennessee Ed Prep federal reporting data to Tennessee licensure data. And then lastly, and I think it was brought up in the comments of thinking about, discuss the timeline, clarify what it means as far as JEP enrollment, JEP completion. And I'll turn over to some of my fellow TAC team members to see if I missed anything.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'm Kim Hawkins, Carson Newman, Dean of Education and Counseling. Thanks so much to the State Board for inviting us to this meeting. I have just a thought on, I think it was Erica's second question on the slide, why we think our traditional candidates do better on EdTPA than our job embeddeds. For us at Carson Newman, and David alluded to this as well, we start EdTPA induction, if you'll allow me to use that, early on in their program. So oftentimes first semester freshmen. So by the time they have finished our program in 4 years, they have had coaching for EdTPA for 4 years. So the job embedded program is like drinking from a fire hose. They are in and out quickly. We are partnering with the school system. So much of their training that they're getting is on the job and in the school system. We don't have them under our care and tutelage as much. That's my thought.
Is it also possible that because they are working a full-time job and they're trying to do their coursework as well, and I would suspect that might be short-circuiting their time spent on preparing, and because they're doing it. And I think that was part of what Michael had shared with us in his presentation, is that these individuals are actually doing the job. They're writing lesson plans. They're in front of their students, and they're teaching, and they're getting that feedback. So I think, I know that was the rationale in terms of more of eliminating that particular responsibility to them. But I'm, and listening to David Shehak, all the points that he made. I think we certainly need to I've been taking notes, I promise you that, and in conversations with Michael and our team and Dr. Sarah Morrison, our executive director, we wanted you here with us so we could get your impressions, not just your impressions, the real impact. And so that's important to take into consideration. And we have time between first and second reading to make any adjustments that we evaluate and assess, especially with what you shared as to what we should and could do. So I wanted to say that, but thank you. Yes, David.
I just wanted to add one more point about the TPA and the lower scores is that we really can't underscore the importance of that mentor. In our traditional programs, that mentor is there to really assist and guide because they're in that classroom together. And because videotaping is involved in those things, are really there to assist and guide that candidate through that TPA process. Just the nature of the job embedded, yes, they have mentors, but they're not in that same classroom. And so if I'm videotaping and then I have to submit that video, sometimes that level of mentorship isn't equal. Although I know those are things we all work on, ensuring and working as an ed prep of that relationship with the job embedded and their assigned mentors. It is different, of having your mentor in the same classroom as you and not having, and especially when we get into times with a TPA and specifically on the videotaping.
Let me go back to a comment that Kim made that they started Ed TPA induction as a freshman, and those that are in job embedded are drinking from a fire hose at sort of the last minute. And right now, the Ed TPA, either you pass or you don't pass. And I'm a professional engineer, and I scored very well on my professional engineering part of the exam, but on the EIT part, I just barely passed. I'm never going to let that license expire because I don't want to take that exam again. Do you see that students who come and drink from the fire hose like that, are they just barely passing those exams? And does that affect the quality of the teacher? Or if they pass the exam, there's very little differentiation between that and the quality of the teaching? And do you see that those that are drinking from the fire hose, can we look to see, are those the ones that just more frequently barely pass versus those that are have been in it for several years? If that makes sense.
Well, say, Kim, I got a thought on that one too, but go.
Well, I was just going to say for me, that would just be clearly anecdotal. So Chiak, you go ahead. I'll defer to you.
Mine's going to be anecdotal too. And I'm going to go back to my video, my mentor example here. So that TPA, you're videotaping and, your classroom, if there's a lot of classroom disruption going on and during that process, you're less likely to pass. Little different when you have that seasoned classroom teacher also in that classroom versus my first year teacher who is still trying to work on those routines and establish and set those limits and to really establish that effective classroom management skills, which is an area that all teachers take time to develop because it is one of those skills that and practices that develop over time. And that's some of the things that we've quite frankly have seen with it. And yeah.
And if you're a well-seasoned, if you're a student teacher or an intern in that classroom with that well-seasoned teacher who wants you to pass and can focus that camera however he or she wants to focus that camera, the argument could be made for a job embedded also, right? But they are hired because there's a need for teachers. There might not be a partner in that school who can come down the hall and video record for you. So
I will speak to some of the data that we've looked at, and this is just my university, my ed prep program, where we have looked at correlating that TPA pass scores with LOE scores, TVOS scores, or just observation scores. And the only thing we found was that it relates to ACT scores. So we've had folks that have gotten 42s on the TPAs, but then low LOE scores. We have folks who have just maybe even failed or just barely passed a TPA, but they're 5s on LOE score. You know, we always try to find that kind of correlation line. It's a beautiful scatter plot that that I'm sure you can anticipate, except for ACT, which thank goodness for your appeals procedures.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could jump in for just a minute. I also have a cold, so I'm trying to preserve my voice over here, but it's always so helpful to hear from our friends at TACD on all of these issues. So I really appreciate the conversation, and I'm also taking notes. Just wanted to say too, this is something Michael had hit on, but as we're thinking about this a TPA proposal that is just on first, or has passed on first reading, we still have time like today to get input, and that's why this is so timely and valuable. You know, one of the things we're trying to do is look across our pathways for licensure and continue to hold the appropriate bar for pedagogy and content for all of our entry level licenses, and to do that with as much parity as possible, but also to remove duplication where we see it. And so some of the suggestions in terms of looking to see if there are other areas for the content kind of check in terms of that major, and also for EdTPA is something we're very much interested in exploring. To date, we've run into some issues around the logistics of using LOE and some other things that have been mentioned, but it's not that we're not open to looking into those things and also these other pathways that might be a good fit for this kind of a policy change. So we'll continue to have conversations with you all about that. One question I wanted to explore a little bit more, if we have time though, is around the timing of an implementation shift. So this is something we've been talking about internally in terms of if it passes on final reading, you know, is it something that's sort of applying to people who are in that job embedded program currently, not just people who are newly entering in September, but would love any thoughts around how we should be thinking about implementation timing.
I'm going to suggest that even if it's eliminated tomorrow, which I definitely, there's members of TACD that would be big fans of that. I'm not probably one of them too. We are still responsible for our state approved program. And so that individual is going to have to do that TPA regardless. Now, it's not consequential, but they're going to have to do it until we're able to update and seek state approval without TPA requirements. And there are some ed programs that require that even on degree completion.
Just to jump in on that comment, because what David is referencing there is when an EPP submits a proposal to the department, there is a very clearly stated program of study, set of assessment requirements, clinical practice requirements, all of it. There has always been sort of a need to have a process by which an EPP can say, hey, we're making a minor change to this program and we need to notify the department. And there's a sort of line that's crossed where minor changes become major changes and the program is no longer the program as it was proposed and approved by the board. And so I think that's what David's referring to there. And I think it's the EdTPA is a primary assessment for virtually all EPPs in their assessment system. That said, I think that there are some opportunities, one, for EPPs to develop their own summative assessments on pedagogy. And two, some EPPs may elect to keep the EdTPA. There's certainly nothing stopping an EPP from requiring the EdTPA if the board were to drop it for licensure purposes. Just wanted to call that out there. I think it would also need to be a discussion between the board and the department as to whether removal of one assessment in an EPP's assessment system constitutes a major change and a reapproval of that program.
Thank you, Michael. And that is exactly where, is it a minor or a major? and then what would be the process?
Dr. Morrison's point, I think her question was about implementation and as far as those people who are currently in the pipeline. It seems to me if the rationale that was expressed by our chair Chair Hartgrove. Hartgrove, I'm not looking at it. My apologies.
It's okay, no worries.
Hartgrove. If it seems if the rationale is that they are already teaching, it seems like it would just apply to everyone as they are already teaching, and that's just my
thought, Dr. Hawkins. I want to test that out with you all though too. Does that feel right in terms of, making it like at the point of licensure transaction, if you are a job embedded candidate and you're going to, advance your license or renew your license, we would allow that exemption.
makes sense to me. I'm one person though.
Okay.
I think I'm Julie Alexander with the University of Tennessee at Martin, and I think I agree with the point of if you're licensed at this moment, looking if you're day one or in year two, I do think that it would be beneficial if we go ahead and omit that for those for those individuals. One reason is we have limited bandwidth at our universities to be able to support job embedded students once they're out of our programs. If they've completed their coursework, they may be just waiting for that assessment, or they may be having to wait a year before they can get back into our rotation for support. I don't know if that's going to be detrimental to them, but it could be something that would be a barrier for them later. So if they could just complete their coursework and whatever the other requirements, I think they would be able to advance their degree a lot faster.
But that's also the key. We also have other post-bac programs that are basically a year-long experience. They're being assessed on state-approved, assessment tools. The primary focus is pedagogy, and they may be required to do a TPA still, or they may still be required to take the practice exam. So we even think of the idea of under what conditions, and then also thinking about accountability. And so that's where I think TACTI kind of fell at, is that we support that licensure flexibility and that assessment flexibility, and just we're exploring for appetites for other clinical pathways because of some concerns of that similar pathways and those conversations with candidates of, I know you're basically in the same program, you're doing the same year, but you have to take these 2 exams and this person doesn't. And then the person moving into that space because of the perceived easiness of it. And now we can only license them in 1 endorsement and not 2 endorsements at the completion of it. And so
follow-up question to that, David. So one thing that I've seen is that the selection of a clinical mentor varies quite a bit, and whether a district or an administrator in a school are actively involved in that process also varies. And so some districts or some principals may approach it with a blanket email to everyone saying, who wants to be a mentor? And if you do, let me know. And the willing kind of jump in and serve as a mentor, while others hand select, say this would be somebody who's a strong teacher and could support a novice educator in a very substantive way. In dropping the EdTPA, that formal requirement, that formal assessment of pedagogy, especially for someone who's not employed as a teacher of record, the importance of that clinical mentor is increased, right? Making sure that that individual who is in front of that prospective educator is strong, not just at teaching, but at coaching teachers and prospective teachers. So do you think that there would be, if that recommendation were broadened, would there be a need to do anything in that space on the policy front to make sure that mentors are well equipped to adequately support prospective teachers?
Well, right now the policy, they have to, be above, a 3, a level 4 or 5 mentor. And I think that's basically about it, or be licensed in a similar or area. And, but I think what you speak to is that the robustness of, or the lack of under the job embedded mentor is not as intentional, I would say. that is definitely an area of that can be strengthened, I think, across local schools and partnerships for the job embedded clinical pathway. We're all pretty good at that traditional piece. And I'm even reflecting on my own personal experience as I went through a job embedded. Now, it wasn't called job embedded at the time. It was Alt-C, if anybody's been that around that long. And, there was that perception where I had mentors and coaches and those things. But, after a few months, they're like, all right, you got to lean into your job a little bit. And that is, I think, some of the challenges under the job embedded is that, they are that teacher of record, they're getting paid the same. And how are we really recognizing mentors and coaches who often don't receive any additional compensation? There is no additional recognition from the Department of Education or the State Board of Education. I mean, we've always advocated. I mean, I know there's differential pay out there in LEAs. We try to leverage, such things. I know we compensate our mentors, and many of our ed prep programs do. So I think if we really want to elevate that responsibility of the mentor, that critical role they have, it would be great to have some state recognition on that front. I mean, more than a good pat on the back from me.
But job embedded, just to, I put in the chat earlier and Bob read it out loud that our enrollment has flipped. We were averaging 5 to 7 job embeddeds per year prior to 2019. And in the fall of 21, we enrolled about 40 job embeddeds. This past fall, we enrolled between 35 and 40, and we already have 16 new for spring. So when I say job embedded has exploded, that's just me here locally. And we only take job embeddeds within a 50-mile radius of us. We don't do them across the state because we feel strongly we have to be able to get to them to mentor them. So.
And being right in your neck of the woods by Carson Newman, ours has greatly increased as well. We had typically always had about 20-ish, and now we're about 150. But our traditional numbers are also up too as well. And I also just want to kind of throw out the idea of the whole grow your own process here as well. I mean, I know our program approved for Grow Your Own is a post-baccalaureate program with an option to, transition to a job embedded practitioner endorsement. But year 2, some may not transition to that. So we will have a cohort possibly of, again, telling one group you're exempt, telling another group you're not.
This is Sharon Cypress, and I'm in West Tennessee. For some reason, I don't know what's wrong with the camera, but it's not showing today. But the same issue is here in West Tennessee as well. And we can have over 100 at job embedded at any time. And we saw the transition probably a little earlier than you all did in East Tennessee, because I'm here in the Shelby County School District in Memphis. So pretty good sized district. And but most of our MAT program is job embedded. There may be 7 traditional students in that program. So I would like to also add, I wanted to jump in earlier, is that our report card scores are heavily impacted by our job embedded folks, because they do have the LOE scores, because they are learning flying the plane as they build it, if you will. And we have those candidates who really cannot conceptualize everything a normal educator or traditionally prepared educator can. They're learning terminology, they're learning acronyms, they're learning what portfolio is, and they're teaching at the same time. So we don't expect them to be as prepared as the undergraduates or as the traditional prepared folks. But at the same time, their scores impact us. And that's where we're trying to get a grip on it. And I'm going to be honest, I'm happy to see a TPA go away for them. I'm extremely happy, and I think all of my colleagues are as well. So.
Again, that's where TACTI started at, and looking at flexibility for others, clinical pathways, and especially pathways that really merit job embedded, minus the teacher of record, that piece. And yeah, and I'm not sure about the right answer for accountability. I know Julie brought up LOE scores. I get the logistical issue.
I ask too on that front. Brooke, you may know the answer to this question, but my understanding of LOE distribution is that it is widely skewed and that a significant percentage of teachers get a 3, 4, or 5, and that there really aren't a lot of 1s or 2s out there.
Yes, that's accurate.
Do you know the percentage offhand?
I would have to grab that from Martha. I don't have it
Okay.
at hand.
So I think that's something else that would need to be considered in tying anything to LOE, that you tie something to the, something that 99, 98% of folks meet, it really kind of loses its value.
What if we just looked at observation scores instead of looking at the total LOE? Just if they required maybe a couple more or something?
I'd be interested there to know if there's much differentiation right now.
With observation scores, there's also the issue that not all districts use the team model, and some of the districts that don't use the team model have a different distribution than those that do.
There's also, and I'm just thinking of this, so I may be wrong in saying this, but back in 2015, we attempted to tie licensure to evaluation, which this is not suggesting that directly, but the General Assembly kind of quickly came behind us and passed a law prohibiting that. But it might be something we'd want to look into if any considerations were made on that front. I have a quick follow-up question for EPPs who are seeing an increase in job embedded. Do you have a rough idea of what percentage of your increase in job embedded are non-traditional candidates that are coming from other careers, maybe career changers, versus those who just graduated, completed an undergraduate program in something else?
From the UTK, the majority are career changers. But there is a good handful, but I wouldn't say, proportionally, that often will, just kind of go right into the job embedded versus, doing our post-bac program and also achieving their master's degree along the way.
And I would say with us at Freed-Hardeman, it's a very small percentage. It's mostly career, just like David just said. Very small percentage of those who come out. Now, we do have our 4+1 programs that we designed where they will do their 4 years of undergraduate and then do that 1 year in the MAT program to get licensed. We only have maybe 5 of those, but of course we're not as big as David's school, but we do have about 5 students, and that one grows because you have your arts and sciences folks who decide to get the MAT while they're there in college and just transition over to grad studies. So yeah, so those programs are fairly new, but we're gradually seeing those students come through.
But that also then brings up a host of questions of what majors will it be the same for job embedded? I'm often reminded of, when I get somebody with an engineer degree and I go, science isn't in the name of it. Sorry, math is not in the name of it. I'll ask, but I have a good chance that you're going to have to take the practice exam. But we also have a lot of majors in our area that kind of like a science education, a math education, majors that have the same number of hours that an arts and science major would have in math and science. Maybe it's unique to our general education requirements and our ability to really merge a strong content under an education major.
So are you saying that an engineer can't get in a job embedded program, teach math or science? Is that what you just said? Did I understand?
No, they can, as long as they pass that praxis to begin with.
No, and they have to take the practice.
Yes, you need to demonstrate content knowledge.
Bob, we tried, we have a gentleman who has a double major in Harvard, from Harvard, with a 3.9 GPA in engineering science. And I can't remember what the other one.
Computer science.
Engineering science, computer science, and a minor in secondary education. And we were told, no, he cannot do job embedded for middle grades math unless he passes the praxis exam. It was refused.
So this is why we agree. Essentially, we're all on the same page. I think it is just there's a lot of this nuance where we could have these two people that are essentially on the same pathway, but one's going to be held to a different standard and not.
But if they had if they were a math major in school, that's what you're saying. They could go and become job embedded and get their license that way. But
well, ultimately they would need to pass the math praxis exam.
They still need to pass.
But we could issue that license basically today as long as you had intent to hire, because
the way the policy is read now, but the proposed policy would do away with the praxis if they have the math degree. But my gentleman with the Harvard degree in engineering science, he has to have passing scores for middle grade math to teach 7th grade math.
That's a great example, Kim.
It's a real example too.
It is. He applied to us too, Kim. Did you?
I think the issue there is that I just know this. I can also hand it over to Brooke to give this response, but the department is not really equipped to do transcript analyses, and so majors typically have to be a 1-to-1. If this passes, I do think it will increase the attention to majors, since it could create a scenario where folks can waive out of the content assessment. And so at a minimum, it would probably be a smart idea for the department to create some guidance around the types of majors that qualify for this, and get out of the business, the kind of 1-to-1.
And certainly it's not unique to Tennessee that has this particular issue with looking at computer science versus math. It's what I've seen in Maryland and some other places. I know that doesn't necessarily alleviate the unique situation, but it's certainly one that I've been in conversation with in other places, looking at the actual number of math classes versus computer science classes that are required for an individual. And I did get those numbers. It was 4%, level 1, level 2 for the LOEs for last year, 2021.
But again, this is where we can have a situation where, similar to what Sharon was mentioning, our 4+1 program or our accelerated master's program, graduating with an elementary major, rather than going into that accelerated master's degree and walking out with elementary and middle grades math, a dual endorsement, they decide to pivot to job embedded. One, does their major count? Because a lot of times we talk about secondary, and this is where I'm concerned about people just kind of bypassing a more traditional pathway under a perceived easier pathway of job embedded. And I always say that as a job embedded teacher, it's not easy. I may just do the Ed TPA back again, but kind of bypassing that in order to forego both praxis exam and both at TPA.
I'm going to just interject at this moment, because I know those of us who are either in the department or in state board, certainly, because this is our committee, but we rely so heavily on the department, and we have such a strong partnership. Dr. Morrison and I and others have been talking about what are the next steps for us in licensure. And so you provide us with excellent information to help guide us. And it would not be an easy task to go through all this. And we would certainly need more discussions with you and other folks. But Dr. Morrison, is there anything you want to share with regard to next steps for us, or what you see in the future without, we don't have a structure for what we're talking. Well, we sort of do have a structure. We have this structure, but there, I think a deeper dive in some of these areas that you all have shared with us today would be certainly important and down the road, but we don't want to wait and go say it's too far down the road. But it does require this partnership with the department, and we know that there is an appetite with the department as well. So, Dr. Morrison, what would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. No, I think it's short term, long term. I think short term, we've got a number of proposals that are up for final reading in February, and this feedback is, like I said, super timely and informative to our staff and our board as we think about some of the what I've been calling low hanging fruits and fixes that we can make that reduce duplication and hopefully free up our pipeline a bit in a year where we know it's desperately needed. I mean, it's always needed, but we know this year more than ever, without reducing sort of our expectations for candidates. And then longer term, and this is a conversation that we're having with the commissioner and her team and, on our staff, how do we look at licensure more holistically and take a step back and decide, are there bigger structural issues that we'd like to take on as a state? I think about every 10 years we need to do that. Michael and I were laughing because we were both at the department about 10 plus years ago when we were looking at this and kind of starting with a clean slate, and things happen, legislation passes, policies pass, and it gets to be kind of a Frankensteinian system, which is not going to best serve our students, K-12 students or EPP students ultimately. So stay tuned for more on that in terms of, the structure and the opportunities to give feedback in the longer term, but certainly please be thinking, because I think we'd like to revisit top to bottom kind of what does licensure look like in terms of the various gates for various pathways, and how can we bring some coherence ultimately to our licensure system that will best serve our state. Michael, is there anything you want to say about any additional feedback opportunities in the short term before final reading? That's the one place I would want to start.
Thanks. I would say my plan at the moment is to make sure board members hear all of this feedback, especially David, it sounds like TACTI is preparing kind of a formal response. I want to make sure that these are all included in materials that board members have between readings and in advance of the final read. So we are receiving some emails from individuals who have caught wind of this recommendation and are trying to understand if or how it would apply to their current situation. But yes, if your EPP or TACTI as an organization or district partners have feedback, please send it my way. I'll make sure it gets saved and shared with board members.
Is there anything else that you all want to share with us before we adjourn this session? On another topic related to EPPs or something related to us?
I just want to thank you all again. And recently, I mean, our enrollment numbers up. And people ask why, how, and it's simply we've been working really hard at just trying to remove barriers for those who aspire to become a teacher, and not just barriers in state and rules and regs and policies at my own institution as well, in terms of admissions. And that is what's really, I think, borne some fruit there. There's folks out there that want to be professional educators. Removing the barriers or those artificial barriers, or at least those barriers that may lack prediction of teacher impact or effectiveness, I think is ultimately a good thing. My only concern is that it's going to be a lot of jockeying on why do I have to do this or why do I not have to do this, and now we have a perception of our professional educators, our current teachers, maybe possibly feeling, oh, they're lowering standards and these things, they're lowering accountability, just so anybody can teach, and this is especially a time when we need to be recognizing our teachers as the professionals they are, and not unintendedly trying to give at least that perception of that we're lowering quality. And I know that's not the goal. I know that's not the goal. I just can hear some of my seasoned teachers out there going, what? So, and
Well, Thank you for sharing that, because we certainly, you know, that's not our intention at all. And we're all in this together. And I think the solutions are a joint effort, and that's across the board. School districts own part of this, society. We've had this conversation before, but together, if we're all doing our part, and I think you're seeing the fruits of you are seeing the fruits of your labor. And so congratulations to you, because we've all been so worried about your pipeline, but everybody owns a part of that too, and helping you in that regard. So thank you again so much for this conversation, and we will continue it, and we value your input. I think you know that by now. I certainly hope so. Any closing comments from anyone else before we adjourn?
I have one final thing. I've had more than one guidance counselor ask how they can become licensed to teach. So I know that's a big conversation, but Michael, I think that would be something really good for the state board to consider also. No conversation needed now, because that would be a huge conversation, but just throw that out there.
Very good. Anything else? Well, once again, thank you all so very much, and we look forward to seeing you again in the not too distant future. Thank you. Take care.
Thank
We're
you.
adjourned.
Thanks all.
We're officially adjourned.